Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, as I'm getting myself organized here. Mr. Pro Tem, I'm going to try something tonight as a variance of something I've done now for years, but I'm going to try to walk through some of the math. But please understand, to anyone who's insane enough to watch this, particularly to staff here on Capitol Hill, I'm trying to treat people like adults. I'm not spinning you. I'm not going to give you the latest polled talking point. I'm not going to give you magic math. This is a moment where we desperately need to understand the scale of the problems. And please understand, you see the people come behind the microphones here on the floor, and there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of problems. But I will argue, though, the systemic threat to this republic is the math. So let's actually do something. First off, for anyone who actually doesn't have a life, I want to strongly encourage you, go to our office's website. I think it's Rep. David. And the reason for that is we've actually set up a little text message. You can sign up for it, and we call it the Daily Debt Update. And every single day, so 5 days a week, you will get a text message from me that says, hey, here's what we borrowed today and the interest cost. So here's what we borrowed per minute. You know, I break it up for a year, day, those things. And then I also say, and here's what we've borrowed so far this fiscal year. So we also give you a 364-day clock, so we get rid of timing effects. And then I'm going to show you what we've taken in what we call receipts. Some people call them tax revenues. That's wrong technically. Government doesn't have revenues. We have tax receipts. And we have now several hundred people who've signed up for this. And the point is, you will get, if you got yesterday's, you'd see we're borrowing about $78,000 a second. $78,000 a second. And then try to explain to me there's not something horribly wrong. No, and one of the points I'm going to try to make here off these charts is the scale. So my brothers and sisters on the left basically turn to us and say, just tax rich people more. That will take care of it. Tax rich people more. They can read. It's their own economists who do these reports saying, well, that actually doesn't get you anywhere close to reality to deal with the gap. And I'm going to show you their own numbers. Now I need to throw some of my own side under the bus. A lot of my brothers and sisters here on the Republican side, we're going to say, well, if you would just cut this portion of discretionary spending, well, you'd make a big difference. No, you wouldn't. We were playing with some math, and it's not done yet because I haven't vetted it, that almost everything we've been debating here for the last 3 or 4 months, at the end of 10 years, it would be basically a rounding error. You'd have trouble even seeing it. We were playing with one bit of math that in 10 years we're functionally scheduled with these new interest rates borrowing about $3.1 trillion in a single year. And with almost all of our cuts actually happened, it might actually not be 3.1, it might just be 3. It's real money. I think we should still do it, but stop pretending that's the saving of the republic. So let's start from the beginning. Let me get my charts organized. This is important, and I'm going to keep doing it till I start hearing fellow members say this out loud repeatedly. Ignore 1965. But do you see this here? This is last year's fiscal year. 23% was on autopilot, mandatory, earned benefits. You know, you turn 65, you've worked worked your 40 quarters, you get Social Security, you get Medicare, you're part of a certain tribal group that might be a contractual, part of a treaty obligation. There's certain benefits you get out there that aren't earned there if you fall under a certain income, but they're part of mandatory. We as members of Congress don't get to vote on it. That's on autopilot. It's purposely, substantially by the left, been put on autopilot so it just happens. Do you see the green? That's what you call non-defense discretionary. That's what you all think of as government. That's the FBI, that's the State Department, that's our salaries, that's the Supreme Court, that's everything. The blue, 13% of the budget is defense. The punchline you need to understand is last year, every dime of non-defense, that green, was borrowed. Every dime of the blue was borrowed, and about $400 billion of the red was borrowed. Every dime a member of Congress votes on is borrowed money, plus a chunk of mandatory. Think of that. If you said, I'm going to balance the budget, God bless you. First, you got to shut down all the defense system. Defense Department's gone. You got to get rid of eventually all of government. And you probably have, last year, you got to figure out what $400 billion you're going to remove from Medicare. That's the math. The math will win. The math is the truth. And we make crap up around here. You got to understand the scale. And if someone tells you, well, we're just not taxing rich people enough. Huh? Or someone's going to tell you, hey, it's foreign aid and waste and fraud. Fine. Get rid of both. Go after waste and fraud. We should be vicious on it. Foreign aid, but don't pretend that it does anything. I think we did a calculation last year, and foreign aid was like 7, 8, 9 days of borrowing. Remember, we're borrowing $6.5 billion a day. That's several times more than most of what we've been debating here for months. I know it's great theater, but the math is the math. So let's actually sort of walk through so there's somewhat understanding, because the point I'm going to try to make in this presentation, if anyone is listening, is the left's saying just tax rich people more doesn't get you there. For my brothers and sisters, I'm one of them, who want to reduce spending. Government is too big. It also doesn't get you there anymore. You're going to have to deal with policy. You're going to have to deal with policy ideas that make healthcare less expensive. You're going to have to deal with policy that makes it so it's something you want to stay in the labor force. You have to do things that not only reduce the cost of surviving in our society, but also make this economy grow. And those are policy. And so one thing we are almost incapable of doing here, because it's complex and the armies of lobbyists in the hallways get upset because they don't want us messing with their current business models. Same thing with the bureaucracies. The bureaucracies here go to war with us when we say, but you could use technology to do that. So let's actually walk through last year's budget. So this is real. What is it? 7 weeks ago, we closed the books on the 2023 fiscal year. We spent $6,371 billion. Okay, you'd realize the problem. Tax receipts were only $4,436 billion. Anyone see a math problem? Why it's important to understand those numbers. That means we borrowed 8.4% of the entire economy was borrowed just last year. 8.4% of GDP was borrowed last year. In a couple slides here, I'm going to show you that taxing the rich, the Democrat proposals, when you actually adjust for its economic effects, you might get 1.5%, maybe 1.6%, 1.7% of GDP. Okay. But you borrowed 8.4% of GDP last year. And I know that sounds geeky, but the reason you often speak in percentage of GDP instead of dollar amount is with the amount of inflation we've had. Remember, if you live in my area, I think I have the highest inflation in the continental United States. In the last 30 months, if you're not making 22% more, you are poorer in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area. You want to know why the working middle class and the working poor are so cranky? Because it's brutal out there for them. The economy is actually okay. I mean, we're seeing some uncomfortable signs of really slowing down, which worries me. There's something wrong. If you get my daily debt update, you're going to see something's wrong on tax receipts. The FICA numbers are falling, and it looks like they're about 5% where they should be, which should be an alarm bell that something's happening in the labor markets. But if you're from the Phoenix, Scottsdale area and you haven't had about a 22% pay hike in the last 30 months, you are poor today. And then you wonder why there's such stress out there in our society. So if I came to you right now and said, okay, what's the number one spend in the United States government? Okay, it's Social Security. This year we're going to spend about, I think, well, I have it on the chart, $1,450 billion will go out in Social Security this year. The punchline on this slide is I want you to understand gross interest. That's interest we pay to people who have bought U.S. bonds. Also the interest when we borrow money, when the Treasury borrows money out of Social Security, we pay it interest. Interest will be over $1 trillion this year. Interest in the United States this year is the second biggest spend. Third biggest spend is not defense, it's actually Medicare now. And the growth rate, I'm going to show you a couple of slides, the growth rate of Medicare and interest are the primary drivers of future spending. And then we're going to talk about how many people lie about what's happening in Social Security, but we'll get to that. And then defense is now the fourth. Defense is now number 4. So every time you run into a leftist, it goes, just cut defense. Could you remind them it's actually number 4 now on the hierarchy of spending? If I had told you this chart a couple of years ago, you would have thought I was out of my mind. It's happened. Gross interest this year will top $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And the net interest, which that just means to outside bondholders, now is well over $800 billion. You do realize just the net interest, if you just want to play the game and say, well, I'm not going to count interest we pay to borrowing from our trust funds, the net interest is going to be more than defense. Why is this not our fixation? Why are there people who are terrified of a debt deficit commission to actually tell the truth about the math? So when I come to you and start saying $1 trillion is just interest, understand why that's so dangerous. Is, okay, so this week interest rates are down a bit. 3 weeks ago they were up. This year, looks like we're going to bring about what do I have on this chart? I think this one's 9.6. Our best guess is about 9.6 trillion to the bond market. This is going to be not borrowing internally. This is going to be issuing bonds out to whoever will buy them. We guess about 2 trillion will be virgin. Those will be, we've excess spend this year. We're going to have to issue $2 trillion of bonds to cover our excess spending. And then the rest of it is refinancing. Because the idiots, excuse me, that's not fair. And there's video of me going back all the way back to, Secretary Lew screaming, interest rates are low, go longer on the curve, go longer on the curve. Sell 30-year bonds. Get us out in the curve. Lock in the low interest rates. And the arrogance of the Treasury, no, you don't know. You're a member of Congress. You're an idiot. What do you know? And now we're going to pay the price for it. Now we're getting our heads kicked in because the short-term thinking that is Washington, D.C. So what you see here in blue, that's refinancing. That's all the 30-day paper, the notes, the bonds. Much of it's coming due. So you're going to bring $9.6 trillion to market at interest rates that are how many times higher than we would have financed a year, 2 years ago. Welcome to our world. And that's why this math is having such trouble. So, just want to make a point. I will get behind these microphones, and sometimes when there's a chance to do a colloquy with one of my Democrat colleagues, they'll go, well, you supported that 2017 tax reform, and it was going to cost $1.7 trillion. And then we start to talk through that, hey, but tax receipts went up dramatically in 2018, 19, first quarter of 2020. Income inequality shrank at its fastest in U.S. history. I mean, it was in many ways the ultimate Goldilocks economy before the pandemic. And we were having to rescore, but you were going to spend $1 trillion. That's what you voted on. No, whether or not more tax receipts came in. Okay, fine. In the first, 2 years, they ran around here. In the first 20 months, they voted for $4.8 trillion of additional spending. Okay, let's see. End of 2017, we did tax reform that grew the economy, made the United States competitive in the world. We shrank income inequality, some of the greatest growth in income and wages without inflation. And the tax receipts and revenues were coming in dramatically over projected before the pandemic. Okay, but step up and be intellectually honest. In 20 months, you spent $4.8 trillion of spending. And we're already finding it's rolling over already. Take a look at the tax receipts from Treasury over the last couple of quarters. Even when you make the adjustments for the California Declaration of Emergency, there's something going wrong. This type of stimulus isn't working. The Keynesian economics is not working for anyone that pays attention to that stuff. So let's go back, and once again, back to interest rate fragility. 22, interest was $475 billion. Okay. 23, interest was $569 billion. Okay. Projection was going to be, remember, this projection was only from a couple months ago. We were going to spend $805 billion. Now it's almost $840, and if you do gross interest, it's over $1 trillion. If you see this, do this chart, interest went up 38% last year in cost. With the scale of the refinance, I haven't done the math, but we think it's going to be up another 30-40% in spend this year. Aren't you happy? Aren't you thrilled? This is the brain trust here, is our growth in spending is going to be healthcare costs and then interest. That's going to really help the economy. And once again, just to reinforce it, because I'm finding if I don't say it over and over and over and over, there's almost this pathological avoidance of math and the truth around this place. Social Security, number 1. Interest, number 2. Medicare, number 3. Defense, number 4. Can't wait to see how many of our fellow members and staff can repeat this. All right. Now for a bit of the punchlines. So my brothers and sisters on the left keep going and saying the solution to everything is we're going to tax people over $400,000. Okay, let's pretend we all agree on that. That's what we're going to do. That's how we're going to save Social Security. Remember, when you have a member, and there's a couple of clowns around here holding up little whiteboards and doing these things saying, Social Security doesn't add a dime to the debt and deficit. They're absolutely right. It doesn't yet. So the letters that I saw, I think it was some of the folks who are involved in AARP and those things wrote letters to the editor over the last month saying, don't blame Social Security for the debt. They're absolutely right. They're telling the truth. And I hope that's intellectually where they're at, that no money from Social Security should ever go into the general fund, but no general fund money should ever go into Social Security. Is that our deal? Because in, 9 years, 2033, so that's like 8.5 fiscal years, there's a 25% cut in Social Security checks. So if you're the average couple in America, $17,400 is going to be your cut. We will double senior poverty. That's the moral imperative we're being given by the left. You can't talk about Social Security. And then when they do put something on paper, it doesn't come close to closing the gap. We're doing some scoring on a couple of the Social Security bills. I was going to bring the charts, but we're not done with the math yet. We think it might close 50%, 60%. But the punchline you got to understand is if we do that, there's no more capacity. There's this concept of, let's say you're a high-income earner. You've done really well in life. You're making over $400,000 a year. Okay. Today, if you live in Connecticut, New York, California, you're paying what? You're probably already at a 50% tax rate, right? So if Congress adds another 12 12.4% would be just Social Security on that. Okay, now you're at 62%. There's actually lots of great economic data that say if we take it beyond that, your incentive, you're going to say, screw it. I'm not working. I'm going to cut back my hours. I'm going to find other ways. I'm just going to live off my savings, those things, my investments. So if you do just pieces of these legislations, they actually take that $400,000 population and push them into the mid 60% of their income. Okay, maybe that's the Democrats' plan, but they need to look at their own economic literature written by their own leftist economists that basically say when you get into that low, mid 60% tax rate, the revenues go down. It's called a tax maximization concept. So there's a good paper out there. If anyone actually wants to read, it's probably about 3 months old, and Brian Riedel, Manhattan Institute, basically took a series of economic papers and say, what's the highest capital gains tax you can do before it rolls over? What's the highest estate tax you can do before it rolls over? Highest income tax? Okay, it's on a nice paper. It's a little long, but it's a really simple read. And they added up saying, take people over 400,000 and maximize every single one of their taxes. Okay, let's do it. Yay, go gang. And when you worked up all the numbers, go read it for yourself. And then you do the economic effects, because you will change the economy. You're going to get maybe 1.5%, 1.6% of GDP. I mean, look, it's partially based on, actually, it's from the U.S. Treasury, the Tax Policy Center, ONB, CBO. I mean, this isn't right-wing Republican math. Anyone remember what we borrowed last year? 8.4% of GDP was borrowed last year. Tax maximization on over 400,000. Okay, let's say you get 1.5, because that makes the math easy. Does anyone see the math problem? Yet, Social Security and Medicare, when you start to look at it over the next decade and a half, go up to 2040, the best projection is it's running about 5.5% of GDP short of cash. Anyone see the math problem? You get 1.5% by taxing rich people, fine, but just the shortfall in Social Security and Medicare is over 5.5% of the economy. We gotta, come on, guys, stop lying, stop making crap up. I know it's great politics, it's great wedges, but at some point we have a moral obligation not to put the doubling of senior poverty. How many baby boomers are you willing to put on the street by making crap up in the math? And for our own side, I know every time we mention Social Security, I'll get ads beating me up at home. So, go online in the Phoenix market right now. There's probably already an ad up saying, Schweikert talked about Social Security, beat him up. I'm trying to save it. And chart after chart after chart after chart, the reality of the math. You take a look at Bernie Sanders' oligarch tax, which, it's taxing unearned capital gains, it's taxing the wealth, it graduates up. So if you're really rich, they take a big portion of your wealth. So everything, it gets you up to, a little less than $4 trillion over 10 years. Great. Except the shortfall is like 18, 19 trillion in that time. Great talking points, get you on MSNBC, you can say crazy things, no one's going to audit your math. Does anyone actually care about what's going on, or is it more important to win the next election? And we come back and forth over and over and over and over and over. Taxing the rich wouldn't pay for the deficit in 2033. We've actually done the tax maximization. So, and this slide's actually already out of date. We went back several months ago. The projection was we were going to be borrowing about $2.5 trillion in the 2033 year. Now we think it's 3.1. And most of that change is just interest. But you do the tax the rich as proposed by the president, and it doesn't even get you $500 billion. So when you do actually the economic effects, So if you're someone who runs around here, you're on the left side, and your answer to everything is just tax the rich, grow up. You know, I mean, it makes it really hard to save. Don't you care about the elderly? Don't you care about these programs? Don't you care? If you care, pay attention to the actual math. And understand just Social Security spending. This is earned. We owe this. We have no idea how we're going to cover the shortfall because even 2100 and some of the other bills, okay, they'll raise a bunch of taxes. They still don't cover the shortfall, and you've taken away all the optionality that was going to be, that tax hike was going to be used to cover the shortfall of Medicare. It was going to be covered the shortfall of everything else in government. You know, at some point, you've hit the wall. And understanding, Social Security last year went up 11%. Our model right now says it goes up slightly under 9% this year. When you start seeing double digits, 9s, 7s, 8s, on a program that's this year will be $1.45 trillion, you start talking real money. And you got a math problem. So this is the slide that gets the most anger calls to my office, so let's do it. Because it happens to be accurate. As a matter of fact, it's already actually out of date, but this is the last official update. Medicare, Social Security, if you go from today through the next 30 years, is pretty much 100% of all the borrowing. The last update was about $116 trillion in borrowing. If you add in today's interest rates, our numbers come up closer to 130 trillion. And I said billion a moment ago, trillion, 116 trillion. If you add in today's interest, our number's getting closer to $130 trillion of borrowing. Discretionary part of the budget, because of its slower growth than tax receipts, is estimated to have about almost a $2 trillion to the positive over that 30 years. Medicare is 80.5 trillion when you add in the interest cash shortfall. Social Security over the next 30 years is 35.8 trillion short. Shouldn't we fix these? Don't we have a moral obligation to keep our promises? Or is the scam here, and this is the point of this floor time. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I've been trying to figure out a way to say, here's your policy split. The left wants tax hikes. The right, and I'm one of them, wants spending cuts. Okay, you can maximize both of those. And it doesn't get you close. You have to do policy. Policy is hard. Policy requires thinking. Policy requires saying no to people that might contribute to you. Policy says, I need you to actually read something. There are things you can do, and I have, Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman has about 2 minutes left.
All right, I will talk faster and not do all the boards. I've come to this mic dozens of, how many times over the last few years, and done things saying, let's talk about the policy revolution. Cures are part of the solution. Cure diseases, change technology, adopt things. If healthcare and interest are our fragilities, then do things to bend that cost of healthcare. I've come here and shown things where you could use technology to functionally dramatically disrupt the cost of healthcare. We've come here and talked about things like this, where you could blow into it, and it's a breath biopsy that's like having a medical lab in your home cabinet. And yes, we make things like that illegal, because this place often is a protection racket. It's a protection racket for incumbent bureaucracies and business models. If we could disrupt the cost of so many things in our society, whether it be healthcare, whether it be the way we do regulation, you could actually set off GDP growth. You could lower the cost drivers of this government. And by doing that, you lower the cost of the financing. You tell the bond markets how serious we are. Maybe they give us some love and credit on our interest rates. There is a path where this can work. You just need members of Congress to deal with the reality Tell the truth about the math. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.